In the spring of 1981, a county health inspector named Gerald Moss arrived at a rural property outside Coshocton, Ohio, following reports of unsanitary conditions and possible child neglect. What he found in the cellar of a sagging farmhouse would haunt him until his death 3 decades later. Beneath rotting floorboards in what had once been a root cellar, Moss discovered a collection of glass jars, 23 in total, each containing a preserved fetal specimen. The dates etched into the metal lids spanned from 1957 to 1979. But it was the ledger he found wrapped in oilcloth beside them that made his hands shake as he read. The handwriting was meticulous, clinical. Each entry documented a pregnancy, the father's name, the mother's name, the expected due date, and the outcome. In 17 of the 23 entries, the father and mother shared the same surname. In 9 of those 17, they shared the same parents. The property belonged to the Harwell family, and according to that ledger, maintained by the family matriarch, Edna Harwell, the bloodline had been turning back on itself for nearly 40 years. Before we uncover what happened in that farmhouse, subscribe and comment where you're watching from. These buried American tragedies need witnesses. The Harwell family had occupied the same 200 acres outside Coshocton since 1891, when Silas Harwell purchased the land with money earned from railroad work. By all historical accounts, the family was unremarkable for 3 generations. Farmers who kept to themselves, attended the Baptist church irregularly, and sold corn and dairy products at local markets. But something shifted in the late 1940s, after the Second World War. In 1947, Silas Harwell's grandson, Vernon Harwell, returned from the Pacific Theater. He'd served as a field medic and had seen things that, according to his sister Edna's later writings, changed his understanding of what God required of a righteous family. Vernon was 31 when he came home. Edna was 23, unmarried, and had been managing the farm in his absence alongside their aging father. Within 6 months of Vernon's return, Edna was pregnant. There is no marriage certificate on file for Vernon and Edna Harwell. The 1950 census lists them both as residents of the same household, along with their father, Silas Jr., who died later that year. It also lists a child, Ruth Harwell, age 2, recorded as Vernon's daughter. The mother's name is left blank. By 1955, Vernon and Edna were the sole occupants of the Harwell property. Church records from the Coshocton Baptist congregation show that Vernon stopped attending services entirely after 1948, but Edna continued to appear sporadically, always alone, always refusing social invitations. A former Sunday school teacher, Marjorie Kemp, recalled in a 1982 newspaper interview that Edna once told her, "We worship in our own way now. Vernon says the church has forgotten the old covenants." What those old covenants entailed wouldn't become clear until much later. But census records paint a disturbing picture. By 1960, the household included Vernon, Edna, and 5 children ranging in age from 3 to 13. All were listed as Vernon's offspring. None had a mother's name recorded. Neighbors rarely saw the children. The Harwell property sat nearly a mile from the nearest road, accessible only by a gravel drive that Vernon reportedly chained shut. A mail carrier named Donald Pritchett later testified that he'd occasionally glimpse figures moving behind the farmhouse windows, pale, thin shapes that never came to the door. Once, in the summer of 1963, he claimed he saw a teenage girl with a swollen belly standing in the kitchen window, staring out with an expression he described as empty, like she'd been hollowed out. When he mentioned it to his supervisor, he was told to mind his own business. But the county couldn't ignore the Harwells forever, because by the mid-1970s, something was going very, very wrong. The first documented medical contact between the Harwell family and the outside world occurred in November 1974, when a young woman named Ruth Harwell was admitted to Coshocton Regional Hospital with severe hemorrhaging. She was 26 years old and in the late stages of a miscarriage. The attending physician, Dr. Peter Gallagher, noted several disturbing details in his report. Ruth appeared malnourished, with signs of chronic vitamin deficiency and poor dental health. She refused to answer questions about her pregnancy or the identity of the father. Most troubling, she exhibited what Gallagher described as profound developmental delays inconsistent with her stated age. Her speech was halting, her affect flat, and she seemed unable to comprehend basic questions about her medical history. When hospital staff attempted to contact her next of kin, Ruth became hysterical. She begged them not to call the farm, repeating, "He'll know, Vernon always knows." Dr. Gallagher filed a report with social services, but no investigation followed. Ruth was discharged 3 days later. Vernon Harwell picked her up in a rusted pickup truck, and according to a nurse who watched them leave, Ruth shrank against the passenger door like a beaten dog. 18 months later, another Harwell woman arrived at the same hospital. Her name was Naomi, age 23, and she was in active labor. The delivery was complicated. The infant, a boy, was severely malformed with microcephaly and clubbed feet. He lived for 4 hours. During the delivery, Naomi screamed a name over and over. "Caleb, please, Caleb." When a nurse asked who Caleb was, Naomi went silent, her eyes widening with terror. She was discharged the next morning against medical advice, before any social services contact could be made. Dr. Gallagher saw her leave. He later told investigators that he'd looked into her eyes and seen someone who'd already died inside. But what connected Ruth and Naomi wasn't documented in any hospital record. It was discovered years later in the cellar ledger. Both women were Vernon Harwell's daughters, and both had been impregnated by their brothers. When Gerald Moss descended into the Harwell cellar in April 1981, he'd been a county health inspector for 11 years. He'd seen neglect, squalor, hoarding, and abuse. But he'd never seen anything like the Harwell farmhouse. The structure itself was wrong. Additions had been built onto the original 1890s farmhouse in haphazard fashion. Rooms that led nowhere, staircases that ended at walls, windows that opened onto interior spaces. Moss described it in his report as architecturally irrational, as though designed to confuse. The main floor reeked of spoiled food and human waste. The furniture was sparse, wooden chairs, a table, mattresses on the floor. The walls were covered in handwritten scripture, biblical passages copied over and over in different handwriting. Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Genesis. The verses all concerned bloodlines, inheritance, and the preservation of family purity. But it was the cellar that broke him. In addition to the jars of preserved fetuses, Moss found stacks of Polaroid photographs. They depicted members of the Harwell family at various stages of life. Many showed young women in advanced stages of pregnancy, standing expressionless against the farmhouse wall. Others showed children, pale, gaunt, with eyes that seemed too large for their faces. One photograph showed a wedding ceremony. The bride couldn't have been older than 14. She wore a white dress that hung loosely on her malnourished frame. The groom stood beside her, one hand gripping her shoulder. He was at least 40, with hollow cheeks and wild eyes. Written on the back of the photo in faded ink, Caleb and Ruth, united before God, June 1969. Caleb and Ruth Harwell, brother and sister, father and daughter to the same man, Vernon. Moss radioed for police backup. When deputies arrived, they found 7 individuals inside the farmhouse. Vernon Harwell, age 65, his sister wife Edna, age 57, and 5 adults ranging in age from 21 to 33, all bearing signs of severe inbreeding, cognitive impairment, physical deformities, and profound psychological trauma. Vernon was arrested. Edna was taken into protective custody, though she never stopped defending him. The 5 surviving children were placed in state care, but 3 would spend the remainder of their lives in assisted living facilities, unable to function independently. The investigation that followed would uncover the full scope of the horror. Edna Harwell's ledger was entered into evidence as Exhibit A in the subsequent criminal trial. It remains one of the most disturbing documents in Ohio's legal history. The entries began in 1950 and continued through 1979. Each documented pregnancy included clinical details, dates of conception, fetal development milestones, and outcomes. Edna had served as the family's midwife, delivering every child born on the property. She'd also performed abortions when pregnancies resulted in unviable specimens, her term for infants too deformed to survive. Of the 42 recorded pregnancies, only 12 resulted in live births that survived past infancy. The others ended in miscarriage, stillbirth, or immediate neonatal death. Edna preserved the remains of 23 fetuses in formaldehyde, storing them in the cellar as what she called a testament to God's trials. The genetic collapse was inevitable. Vernon had fathered children with his sister Edna, then fathered children with his own daughters. Those daughters had been impregnated by their brothers, Vernon's sons, who were also their half-brothers. The family tree had become a closed loop, a genetic spiral that turned inward with every generation. Medical examinations of the surviving Harwell descendants revealed catastrophic inbreeding effects, severe intellectual disabilities, skeletal deformities, congenital heart defects, and immune system failures. One woman, identified in court records only as Subject D, had the cognitive function of a 6-year-old, despite being 31. Another, Subject B, was blind, deaf, and had never learned to speak. But perhaps the most disturbing element of the ledger wasn't the medical data. It was the tone. Edna wrote with detachment, almost pride. She described the family's isolation as necessary separation from the fallen world. She referred to the incestuous unions as sacred marriages ordained by Vernon's divine revelation. She documented each miscarriage and deformed birth not with horror, but with resignation, as though genetic catastrophe was simply the price of righteousness. In one entry from 1971, she wrote, "Ruth delivered a girl child today, but the Lord saw fit to take her before dawn. Caleb wept, but Vernon reminded him that purity requires sacrifice. We buried her beneath the oak tree, the 7th such burial. The bloodline will endure." Investigators later excavated the property. They found 11 infant remains buried in shallow graves around the farmhouse. Vernon Harwell's trial began in January 1982 and lasted 4 weeks. He was charged with multiple counts of rape, incest, child abuse, and unlawful detention. The prosecution presented the ledger, the photographs, the medical reports, and testimony from the surviving victims. Vernon never testified. He sat in the courtroom in silence, his eyes fixed on the middle distance, occasionally mouthing scripture. When the guilty verdicts were read, he showed no reaction. Edna, testifying as a witness, defended him to the end. She insisted that their family had been chosen by God to preserve a pure bloodline, that the outside world was corrupt and fallen, that their isolation was holy. When the prosecutor asked her if she understood that she'd enabled the rape and abuse of her own children and grandchildren, she replied, "We did what the Lord required. Vernon heard his voice and I followed." She was deemed mentally unfit to stand trial and committed to a state psychiatric facility, where she died in 1997, still insisting that Vernon had been a prophet. Vernon Harwell was sentenced to 9 consecutive life terms. He died in prison in 2003 at the age of 87, having never once expressed remorse. In a final interview with a prison chaplain, he reportedly said, "They don't understand. We were the last righteous family. We were supposed to be the seed." The 5 surviving Harwell descendants were given new identities and placed in care. Only one, a man referred to in records as David H., ever spoke publicly about his experience. In a 2009 interview with a true crime journalist, he said, "I didn't know it was wrong. I thought everyone lived like we did. I thought it was normal for your father to be your grandfather, for your sister to be your wife. When they took us away, I didn't understand why. I still don't, not really. How do you explain the world to someone who was never part of it?" He died by suicide in 2011. He was 43 years old. In the years following the trial, investigators attempted to trace the origins of Vernon Harwell's beliefs. What had transformed a returned soldier into the architect of a decades-long incestuous nightmare? The answer, as fragmentary as it remains, seems to lie in Vernon's war experience and his obsessive religious reinterpretation. Letters found in the farmhouse attic, written by Vernon between 1947 and 1950, reveal a man unraveling. He described visions he'd had in the Pacific, divine revelations that told him modern society was corrupted, that the bloodlines of the faithful had been polluted by race mixing and secular marriage, and that God required a return to biblical purity. Vernon had fixated on passages in Genesis describing the early patriarchs, where familial intermarriage was common. He'd become convinced that the original human family had been genetically perfect, and that inbreeding only became dangerous after the fall, when sin corrupted human biology. His twisted logic concluded that a sufficiently righteous family could restore that original purity through isolation and controlled reproduction. He'd shared these beliefs with Edna, who'd been desperate for purpose after their father's death and Vernon's return. She'd become his first convert, then his first victim. The rest followed with terrible inevitability. What makes the Harwell case particularly chilling is how long it persisted undetected. For over 30 years, a family engaged in systematic incest and genetic catastrophe less than an hour from a mid-sized American city, and no one intervened. Neighbors saw signs, medical professionals filed reports, but a combination of rural isolation, institutional apathy, and the family's extreme reclusiveness allowed the horror to continue. Dr. Gallagher, the physician who'd treated Ruth and Naomi, later said in an interview, "I knew something was deeply wrong. But in 1975, in rural Ohio, you didn't press too hard on family matters. There was this attitude of people have a right to privacy, even when that privacy was clearly concealing abuse. I failed those women. We all did." The Harwell case prompted reforms in Ohio's mandatory reporting laws and led to increased training for medical professionals in recognizing signs of familial abuse. But those reforms came too late for the victims who'd already been born, broken and buried on that isolated farmhouse property. The Harwell farmhouse still stands. After Vernon's arrest, the property was seized by the county and later sold at auction. It's changed hands 4 times since 1981. No owner has stayed longer than 3 years. The current owner, whose identity is protected by privacy laws, has reportedly left the structure largely untouched. The additions Vernon built remain, their architectural wrongness preserved. The cellar where the jars were found has been sealed with concrete, but locals claim you can still smell something foul rising from the ground on humid summer nights. People in Coshocton don't talk much about the Harwells anymore. The case brought unwanted national attention to the town, and there's a collective desire to forget. But forgetting is impossible when the evidence still stands, when the graves are still there beneath the oak trees, when the descendants still live somewhere with new names and shattered psyches. In 2016, a paranormal investigation team requested permission to explore the property. The owner refused, but footage later surfaced online claiming to show the exterior of the farmhouse at night. In the grainy video, lights appear in the upstairs windows, flickering, moving from room to room. Skeptics note that the footage is easily faked, but those familiar with the case remember that the house had no electricity after 1965. Vernon had cut the power lines himself, insisting that the family live as the patriarchs had lived. Whether the lights are real or fabricated, they've become part of the local law. Teenagers dare each other to approach the property after dark. Some claim to hear singing coming from inside, hymns in discordant voices, too many voices for an empty house. The Harwell bloodline ended in institutions and early graves, but the site of their suffering remains, a monument to the worst impulses of religious fanaticism, familial control and isolation. There are tragedies that history remembers with ceremony, wars, disasters, public atrocities. And then there are tragedies that rot in silence, hidden in rural basements and buried under oak trees, known only to the victims who can't speak and the documents that no one wants to read. The Harwell family was destroyed not by outside evil, but by its own twisted conviction. Vernon Harwell believed he was righteous. Edna believed she was faithful, and the children born into that nightmare had no chance to believe anything at all. The cellar jars are gone now, destroyed as evidence after the trial. The ledger remains in a state archive, restricted from public viewing. The photographs were sealed by court order. The graves were exhumed, the remains cremated and scattered. Every physical trace of the Harwell bloodline has been systematically erased, as though Ohio itself is trying to scrub the memory clean. But the farmhouse still stands, and on certain nights, when the wind moves through Coshocton County and the trees bend low over the gravel drive, locals say you can still feel it. The weight of what happened there, the genetic collapse, the children who never had a chance, the women who were buried alive in their own family. The Harwells are gone. But the horror they created lingers, written in chromosomes and trauma, in sealed records and unmarked graves, in a house that refuses to fall, no matter how many people abandon it. Some bloodlines end with a whimper. Others end with a scream that never quite fades. And in Coshocton, Ohio, if you listen closely on quiet nights, you can still hear it echoing through the trees.